Steve, Rob, thanks for taking the time to talk today. We just participated in a roundtable discussion with uh, representatives from DoD, from the Army, from NIST, from GSA, from USCIS, from a host of agencies talking about identity and access and credentialing management, ICAM. One of the, if you will, a topic that's really reemerged over the last 6 months, even year. But with COVID and cloud and so much going on around identity management and so much changes happening in technology, let me start with Steve. Walk me through a little bit of what you're seeing. Are things going around identity management over the next 12, 24 months or so?
Well, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic forced people to move very quickly to enable people to work from home, which in some cases made it difficult to use strong two-factor authentication. And we saw a huge demand to provision a lot of their workforce with alternative forms of two-factor and to help them use the two-factor that they already had. Now going forward, what we're hoping to see is sort of a normalization of this effort, making sure to put in place policies about what types of two-factor authentication should be used from a home environment versus in the office, et cetera. So put policy around what has sort of been established ad hoc over the last 6 months to a year, or last 6 months. It seems like a year, doesn't it? So it's oddly, all these discussions, as the listeners, as they read through the white paper that we just participated in producing, will see that even though you like to talk about complicated forms of authentication, new ways to behavioral analytics, although you like to talk about the technology, it always comes down to policy, governance, and putting the right procedures in place. And to me, that's what I see going forward in the near term.
Rob, one of the things that Steve talks about here is the different policies for home versus office versus wherever you're trying to work. My impression was agencies had tried over the years to do that one size fits all. Hey, if you're logging in from home, logging in from the office, you got to have your CAC or your PIV, and you got to have a reader, and you got to get through the network that way. But the COVID pandemic really changed the way agencies starting to look at, well, maybe we don't need to go through that type of process. Maybe there is one that's just secure, but maybe a little bit easier.
Yeah, Jason. So I think that, as Steve said, the connective tissue between the emerging technologies and the business processes and the legacy infrastructure really has to sort of catch up with one another. So moving forward, the Common Access Card, I rolled out 55,000 of them in the year 2000. So it's been around a long time. It has served a fabulous purpose of blending logical and physical access in a single token. So that being said, as you move forward, and we've learned from many discussions over the past year, and now we've had COVID hit us with this distributed network, you have this amorphous perimeter now, right? So now it is really all about identity, right? That's really the key part of the, I'll say, zero trust architecture, is the identity token and granting access to applications and data wherever they may be, from wherever this person who's using them should be, and that they are credentialed sufficiently to have those accesses. So to me, you can look back and say the fundamental being the Common Access Card, is that still germane for many of the use cases? Maybe, maybe not, right? Can you say that, are there other technologies that have emerged since the CAC and PIV emerged that produce that viable set of security parameters to enable access from anywhere, anytime, any location, proving that you're you? So I think the answer is yes to both questions, right? I think we have to get to the place where we have to reconcile, as Steve said, policy with use case, with technologies, and then obviously the legacy infrastructure. I mean, this is a journey that has taken a long time to get to this point. And when the COVID and the distributed workforce and the telework went from 5% to 98%, right? It really drove change in what we had to be able to do. And so we provided those kinds of tokens for a while. Now everybody's got them, and now there are many activities going on at various agencies to sort of come to that. This works for us, and I think that umbrella concept probably needs to get its arms around it. As Steve said, what's that policy that governs the use cases so now everybody knows what they should be doing as they move forward.
Rob, you bring up the fact that you rolled out 55,000 common access cards in 2000. So here we are, 2020, a couple years later, right? Now there's millions of common access cards out there, millions of PIV cards out there. Give me a sense of why these as form factors still have benefits, but also there's also some things about them that maybe we'd like to move on from. I know there's been some push over the years from DoD, some push from civilian agencies. Well, what's beyond the CAC? What's beyond the PIV? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Jason, it's a good question. I think the use cases drive what authentication credential is appropriate. For example, the DoD needs a Geneva Conventions card. The CAC is that card. Now, it was also at the time, 20 years ago, thought, hey, let's merge logical and physical access into a PKI-based token and use that. And that worked it works fine. The question now is, as you're in the distributed workplace, there's a cost to it. There's lots of things that you could consider that weren't available when the technologies of the Common Access Card were developed, the PKI, X509 certificates, things like that. I think it's always time to stare at what are the requirements and what are the technologies to support those requirements. And then you can decide if they're worthy of standardization, right, as the next thing. The next thing has many use cases. Cloud did not exist in the year 2000 and 2001. It exists now. The cost of IT infrastructure is always a concern of a CIO or a CISO. So at the end of the day, someone would have to stare, is there a business case to make this swap to that end? I think the combination of heretofore disparate authentication technologies may prove useful at this point. There's lots going on in the FIDO world. There's lots going on in one-time passwords. There's lots going on in biometrics. And so how do we stare at those sets of technologies that enable us to authenticate and get access to applications and data, and then really have the system recognize that, and maybe there's behavioral profiles that are attached to that the system goes, yep, that is Rob Carey or Jason Miller or Steve Schmaltz, and I know where he is. I know what he's supposed to get access to. I can change what he gets access to based upon where he is, those kinds of things. That fine-grained opportunity needs to be just thought out and strategized so that you can determine how much farther or forever, is not forever, but is the CAC that thing, that token that will carry us for the next, prospective years, or do we need to migrate on to something else that is of a stronger authentication nature and maybe is more economical for the country or for the use of the government as they move forward?
Steve, do you want to weigh in a little bit? Because there's also a piece here that the Common Access Card, PIV cards, are both your logical and your physical access tokens. And while that seemed like a good idea 20 years ago when we didn't have smartphones, when we didn't have computers in our pockets, but now we do. And there are ways to address kind of the logical access much different. And there's ways to address physical access much differently.
Well, I think an important point to make here is that as effective as the CAC card has been, there are situations where it just doesn't work. And almost as importantly, there are very secure enclaves within the DoD where peripheral devices just aren't allowed, or where they would prefer not to have peripheral devices. So the ability to plug in a smart card reader or to even use a smart card reader is frowned upon in those highly secure situations. And it's in those situations that you would need something like an OTP, a hands-off, a device where you read the number off and type it in. I don't know if the threat was as fully understood 15, 20 years ago as it is now. The ease of the ease of introducing malware into devices through these peripherals, but that one fact means that the CAC and PIV cannot be the entire solution. It will not meet every use case. Going forward, obviously, as you see the authenticators develop, and I'm sort of trying to build on what Rob just said, you've got to take all that into account. I don't know if I see a single authenticator working in every situation, but you don't know. And we have to look at the possibilities and try to continue to collect the use cases and determine what the best solutions are.
One of the things that I think Steve brought up is this idea of use cases. It also seems to me that the numbers of use cases are growing too, where in the past the use case was in the office or maybe mobile, maybe with a laptop somewhere. But now we have use cases that spawn much broader because you bring in the connected devices, Internet of Things, you bring up other ways to say, how do I get from my wherever I am to the network, to the data? Rob, does the use cases also start to create that need, that drive for a new approach to identity management?
So the tremendous number of use cases that exist today with the blossoming of technology in the mobility space really does drive, as Steve was alluding to, a different answer, right? The CAC was, in fact, a one-size-fits-all for probably 90% of the use cases in the past. And there are many uses for a physical access token. There are many uses for a logical access token. They intersected tremendously 15, 20 years ago. Many of the use cases, as Steve was alluding to, don't intersect. And the cost of provisioning that tool is pretty high, right? It's not a cheap or an ineffective financially. So to me, as we move forward, we have to start to think about this. What's the broad strategy that may enable a set of technologies that are used, that meet the NIST requirements, that dial in on these various use cases? Because the statement of any device, anytime, anywhere, any authorized person is still germane. But now what lays underneath that is the thing that has to really match up, right? So somebody deployed in Afghanistan might have a very different use case than somebody in a skiff at Fort Meade, than somebody operating at GSA downtown that's operating at home, right? So while we might want to have them all be the same, it may be very difficult to have them. And then combined with that is we have a demand signal now, because we're doing everything online, for citizen services to be rendered by credentialing themselves. So now you have a broader demand signal for citizens to have similar credentials that are validated. You know, we all have the Real ID standard and things like that. So the question is, are we in the necessary and sufficient level for all these use cases? And I think the answer is not quite yet, but there's work to be done. And I think hopefully there's the government's focusing on it, and we stand ready to help them.
The last piece of this conversation I want to just touch upon briefly is we hear a lot about artificial intelligence, machine learning, behavioral analytics. A lot of this is where I think people have been hoping to go with authentication and access control processes. Rob, you and I probably remember when Terry Halverson was the DoD CIO, and he talked about moving on beyond the CAC and said, well, it's going to be the way you walk or the way you type or all these different kind of like, I type the way I type and Rob types the way he types and Steve walks the way he walks, and it's hard to kind of replicate that. Or how close are we to that? Is that something, I mean, I think you heard some of it from Bill Graves over at Army, where the biometrics and face, you're starting to see some of that build up, but not necessarily behavior. Is that the 5 years, 10 years down the road? Where are we heading?
You know, my opinion, Jason, is for certain use cases, that stuff works right now. For other use cases, again, depending on the data and the technology you're trying to use with AI to learn behavior, that data could be 2 to 5 years away from being able to be consumed at machine speed, rendering a decision literally in the queuing instance of when you expect to be granted access, if that makes sense. Sound like a mouthful, but I think that Terry was right in that we really need to get there. We need to get to the place where we are granted access at machine speed. Today, we are granted access at machine speed based upon the credential tokens that we have. But as we make the tokens more complex or we add features to the tokens, we really do need to bring in behavioral analytics that says, right, in my risk score for what I just got entered leads me to believe that that's Steve Schmall is trying to get in or it's not. And so I think that works to a large extent, but you have to consider ease of use, use case, cost, all those kinds of things before you decide that you're going to just implement this. So I think we're working on it, and I think I laud the people that are working on that, but I don't know of any magic ahas that have hit the screen yet. So I think it's a couple of years away from us before we start to mainstream this stuff. Steve?
Yeah, just to echo that, there's some places, there's some scenarios where it works, and fraud detection is one of those areas. So you may not be able to determine effectively whether or not, with my behavior, whether or not somebody's masquerading as me. But you could absolutely determine in a large population of people whether or not somebody is committing fraud if the population of people you're looking at and if the amount of data that you're looking at is large enough. So an example is in the financial community where looking at online fraud, you can absolutely model it and identify that pretty effectively. So that sort of leaves us in this area where we have to do more research, we have to do more development, we have to refine our tools to try to recognize an individual's behavior and determine if that behavior is abnormal enough to alert on, and to get that to be effective enough where the type 1 and type 2 errors just don't make it ridiculous. But right now we can do fraud detection. And more importantly, right now we can do anomaly detection. So across the board, monitoring everything, we can identify stuff that just doesn't look right. And that does add some extra identity assurance, for lack of a better term, when it comes to whether or not the people on your network are who they say they are.
Rob, Steve, this has just been a fascinating conversation. I really do appreciate your time. So let me thank my guests. Rob Carey is the Vice President, General Manager for Global Public Sector Solutions at RSA. Rob, always great to catch up.
Thanks, Jason.
And Steve Schmaltz is the Field Chief Technology Officer for the Federal Group at RSA as well. Steve, always good to catch up as well.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.